have you been experiencing certain power cuts recently? And ever wondered, how did we really get here? Well, there are so many talks about alternative energy, questions about why can't we go solar? Why can't we look at other forms of energy supply? Why is it that it has come to a point where on a daily basis we are worried, will we have power cuts today or tomorrow? Certain problems may be easy to look at and criticize from a political angle, but it's always best to be informed on the multiple dimensions in terms of economics of certain matters, scientific aspects of another matter as well. And here in Bisnomics, in your weekend's most profitable 60 minutes, we intend to power up your knowledge and insight with speaking to various experts on relevant pertinent topics. And today, our focus will be on the current energy sector issues of Sri Lanka, and we are in conversation with Professor Priyantha Wijayatunga, who is the head of the energy sector group in the Asian Development Bank. Professor, welcome to Bisnomics. Absolute pleasure to have you with us.
Nice to be here too.
Professor, let's look at some of the basics when it comes to the energy consumption. Now, what is Sri Lanka's average annual energy consumption demand, and how is it distributed across different segments like homes, industries, and so on? Demystify to us the current situation.
Yeah. Once again, Taridu, thanks a lot for the invitation extended to me to join this program. And as far as Sri Lanka is concerned, roughly, I got the statistics from our colleagues. We have a consumption of about 14,000 million units. It was in 2020, and 2019 it was slightly more. In 2020 it went down because of COVID. And if you look at the distribution of this consumption across different subsectors, domestic roughly about 40%, and then industrial about 30%, and commercial sector roughly about 26% also. The rest is of course very small, street lighting and religious purposes.
Professor, what about the current level of capacity, the amount of energy, especially the electric energy that we can supply to the market? Where are we on that?
If I can remember right, generation capacity somewhere in the range of about 3,000 to 3,500 because the peak load seems to be somewhere around 2,500 or so. So we have quite a good generation capacity to supply the demand. But mind you, when you say capacity, you have a lot of hydro capacity in it. Hydro capacity, you may not be able to get the same megawatts at all the times
of the
year. When you have water, you may get all that capacity. You may not get it during certain times, during dry season.
Professor, now let's talk about the source, because we are always talking about the energy consumption and the levels of energy we need, but now I think the problem is the source, as you very correctly said. Not all sources are equally reliable and available to us throughout the year, and that seems to be the problem as well. Yeah. What are the main energy sources of Sri Lanka, and how are they distributed in terms of percentages?
If you look at let's stick to the power sector. When you say energy, you have all the other sectors too coming in, particularly the transport sector where you use a lot of oil. But if you take the power sector,
there is mainly electricity.
It's major portion comes from hydropower. But of course, as I said, depending on the years, whether it's dry season more or rainy season more, you might get different percentages. As roughly in 2020 or so, I think roughly about 30% was from hydropower. Then you have coal, as you know, we have more or less another 30 to 40%. If I give you exactly the number, it must be somewhere in that range. Yeah, about almost 40% coal. And then we have oil fired generation providing a substantial capacity to the system, and that's the problem now. Yeah.
Now, in terms of energy security, Professor, because I think that this is the bigger question that everyone is having, and in everyone's mind, they want to know, are we as a nation able to say, because we talk of physical security of a nation, we talk about food security of a nation, and the biggest concern now is the energy security. Can we say that as a nation, for the next few years, we are secured in terms of our energy, or is it in jeopardy? It's a very direct question, but I think it's a question we need to ask at this time, and the nation wants to know an answer.
Definitely. When it comes to energy security, you have to look at it in different angles. There are countries with no energy sources at all should be imported. So the security depends on how reliable your supplies are, right? And Sri Lanka does not have a lot of fossil fuel sources anyway. I mean, we are still, thinking that we might have gas resources in
Mena Basin.
But we have not yet taken it out. Economics may not have worked properly. So overall, our major energy supplies will have to come from outside. That we have to, accept, and you cannot basically deny that fact. But at the same time, whatever you can generate or bring in from domestic sources, that's what we should try hard to do. So hydropower is one of the main sources, domestic source. So energy security point of view, it's a very good source of primary energy, which can convert into power or electricity. And then we can look at other renewable energy sources, which are all local, like wind power, solar power, and so on. But at the same time, we have to be mindful, these different sources have different functions. They may not be able to provide the same energy services as that of coal power or natural gas or for that matter, oil-fired power plants, because they in terms of operational flexibility, they are much more flexible as against renewable energy and hydropower, because they are seasonal. You don't have control over the input or the primary energy source itself. So you have to have a combination of these things to improve or maximize the energy security in the country.
Professor, when you look at renewable energy, because I want to ask about this, the very same term you mentioned, the economics. Because it's a well-known fact that renewable energy, in the initial short term, yes, the cost may be high, but it pays dividends in the long run. If you look at Iceland, for example, many years ago, they were heavily dependent on burning fossil fuel for supplying their power. But today, over 75% of Iceland's energy comes from their own renewable internal sources. Of course, it's a land of fire and ice. They have their own geothermal power generation abilities as well. Isn't Sri Lanka delaying the renewable adoption too much by only looking at the economics and not looking at the long term? What are your thoughts? You're the expert on this topic. What are your thoughts?
Again, all these depend on country to country. It changes the circumstances. It's easier said than done when it comes to renewable energy, because you may have to have lot of things to put together to bring in a lot of renewable energy into the. For instance, let's take wind power. You have to have enough wind, and in Sri Lanka we have a lot of wind, but at the same time you have to find land. And you have to look at other constraints, like we have a lot of biodiversity in the system. You have a lot of birds flying around. You have
Correct.
to be quite careful with it. If you take solar panels, again, a large-scale solar, establishment of power park, solar parks may not be as easy because we don't have a lot of land. I mean, we are one of the most densely populated countries in the world, and we have to keep that in mind. And also, our land has alternative, uses also, agriculture and so on. So, as far as Sri Lanka is concerned, we have to look at those things also. So, we need all the renewable energy, no doubt, we have them, but then how fast we can develop them, of course, we have to be mindful of those constraints also.
Is it possible for you to give a quick synopsis from a very professional angle on the current power crisis we are facing? What has brought us to the situation where we are experiencing regular power cuts right now during these days and weeks?
Of course, it's very important, whether it's renewable energy or conventional energy, it's important that we, go with a, generation plan, and we have to implement it on a regular basis. The power plant should come and so on. So, unfortunately, there has been delays right throughout, not just these few years, but right throughout there has been delays in getting power plants, most economic power plants in place. As a result, of course, naturally, when you put up power plants, you can't put up power plants overnight. It takes a while. If you take traditional power plants, it may take years. For instance, a hydropower station, to put up a hydropower station, it might take about 5 to 10 years, depending on the size of the power plant. If you take a coal power plant, another 4 or 5 years. Natural gas, again, similar time frames. Of course, things like solar and wind can come in faster, maybe within a matter of 1 or 2 years. But then the intermittency of these renewable energies will have to be addressed. And so that's why I always say there should be a mix of these different technologies. And Sri Lanka has been, our implementation, our generation plans has been slow and may not be as fast as we would like to see. That's one of the reasons why we face these power cuts.
So, we haven't got the right mix of energy or the power supply sources right. Is that the concern?
We may have already, on paper, we may have got the right mix, but
Implementation.
implementation has been delayed for various reasons. Again, I mean, there are good reasons maybe for the delays, but then we ended up with power cuts as a result.
And Professor, in terms of the current situation, because we are aware that certain power stations have had certain breakdowns and it's taking time to really come back to the same usual level of supply. So do you see that as a policy and as overall planning, we need to have better planning in this matter?
Yeah, I mean, planning has been pretty good here, frankly speaking. I know Ceylon Electricity Board has been having a very good plans developed, and important thing is implementation of these plans. And of course, at the same time, you have to think of financing also. You know, when you can't just have plans, and if you don't have financing, you can't do much.
Correct.
So you have to put all these things together and regularly implement the plans. That's what is important. And probably it's time that we focus very much on implementation of the generation plan as much as possible, and also diversify. You know, we may not have looked at renewable energies in the past as much as we should have, and I think it's time that we think of those, because renewable energies can be implemented faster, and it's domestic, it's a resource, and we don't have to rely on all these dollar issues, for instance.
Doctor, if you look at some of the developments in the world, for example, we see countries like Japan now relying on the power generation from tidal waves. But has Sri Lanka even considered some of these new developments? Maybe they have, because they are in the forefront of this energy sector. You see what's happening in this country. But are we a little behind in the power generation innovation cycle?
No. Not really, actually. Some of these are good technologies, no doubt about it, but they are not as commercialized as solar and wind. So, I mean, from a reliable generation viewpoint, you need to look at the cheapest and the most reliable ones first. Even if the other technologies are there, they may be there, but they may not be fully commercialized to the extent that we can rely on them in a large scale development. But when it comes to solar and wind at the moment, from renewable energy perspective, I think they are quite reliable and cheaper to implement at this time. So probably we have to look at them first. Others can come in as almost like pilots and to try out and see whether they will work for Sri Lanka. But you should not rely on them completely to supply our needs.
In the global business world, where exactly are the different continents in terms of their own energy security issues? Is this problem only limited to Sri Lanka? Let's find that out on the other side of this break. This is Bisnomics. Welcome back to Bisnomics, your weekend's most profitable 60 minutes. I'm Tharandu Amarasekara. Our focus today is on the current energy-related issues in Sri Lanka, the crisis we face, and what can be done differently. And we are in conversation with Professor Priyantha Wijayatunga. Professor, let's talk about a global perspective, because initially when these developments were happening, it compelled me to do a little bit more reading to see what's happening in the world out there. Is this something limited only to us? Apparently, it's not. If you look at China, we see that they are grappling with power issues, especially as the economy is rebounding and the production and commercial activities are picking up. We see countries like Europe heavily dependent on energy supplies for the heating, especially during these cold months, and safe to say almost being held ransom by certain countries like Russia. And on the other hand, we see certain pockets of Europe, for example, Iceland, being very successful, extremely successful with using renewable energy, thermal power, hydro, and so on. And I read a very interesting concept in Iceland where they have about 15,000 waterfalls, but only 15 hydropower plants. That way they say they keep the balance between the nature's beauty and the power generation needs. What are the interesting developments in the global power supply sector and energy sector that you are seeing, Professor?
Yeah, I mean, one example is this extreme weather. The reason being, of course, we attribute that to climate change. Right? If you take Sri Lanka, for instance, we are experiencing very hot, days these days. I mean, compared to the when we were small, right? 33 degrees in Trincomalee at the time used to be very hot. Now 33 degrees is nothing compared to the kind of temperatures we experience now, which means you need a lot of air conditioning. And at the same time, you have other extremes like very cold weather in certain parts of the world, which means you need a lot of heating. So all these put together, you have extremes of electricity demand or energy demand in these countries, which means we may not be able to supply with the existing capacities you have sometimes, because these are unexpected events. And as a result, naturally, you may have to have rotating power outages and so on and so forth. Also, the other one actually, the other reason these days is COVID impact. Because of the pandemic, the supply chains have been disrupted drastically, particularly when it comes to fossil fuels, the fossil fuel supplies, the gas supplies and the oil supplies and so on, or more than oil supply, gas supplies and coal supplies may have been affected. As a result, you have power generation plants, but you don't have the primary energies to run these power plants.
And in some countries, there are no people to work and run the power plants.
Exactly, exactly. So this is true for energy sector too. I mean, these issues with manpower. So put together, energy security issues are different in different countries, and these are some of the things we may not have experienced at all before, and or expected and planned for before. So that's why we need to carefully plan our systems. Now that we have experienced the pandemic, we have another lesson to learn, and accordingly we should plan. Now in Sri Lanka, as you know, we are having power shortages now. Now we should think how to avoid this kind of a situation in the future. What kind of diversification is required? Whether we should be much more efficient in using electricity, for instance, compared to what we used to do, and how we can save energy, and then at the same time move away from some of the sources of energy on which we rely on and we cannot rely on anymore. So from that viewpoint, renewable energy will have to be focused much more. But at the same time, of course, they have their own issues. Then we should try to solve those issues and move forward to a more cleaner energy system.
Professor, right now the situation, because we hear that very regularly the authorities, prominent members of the authorities saying we don't have fuel, therefore we can't generate power, so we have to go for a power cut and so on. So these months of the year, January, February, are they the months usually where there is a lack of hydropower supply? Is that the reason why we are facing this? And also, you mentioned about coal. Now, there are different arguments when it comes to coal. Some believe that it's still one of the cheapest sources of power generation, but then throw in the environment to that equilibrium, how do you really balance it off? So my first question, are we in a time of the year where usually hydropower supply is less due to rainfall issues? And number two, when it comes to coal, the equilibrium between environment and economics, how do you see that playing out?
Yeah, this is quite interesting actually, how we look at traditional fossil fuel fired power. It's not just coal, but also natural gas, oil, and so on and so forth. You have to carefully look at this. For instance, in Asian Development Bank, we have now incorporated in our economic analysis the social cost of carbon as part of the economic analysis. So coal may not be as cheap as it used to be when you
consider the overall impact.
So it all depends on working with these new numbers and the overall internalizing the environmental damage of this power plant, environmental costs in the analysis. So you have to look at all these things very carefully when you decide, when you plan a system. So coal power plants may not be as attractive as it used to be when you have social cost of carbon incorporated into the analysis.
Correct. Because end of the day, we are trying to fight two numbers here, isn't it? One is the what we call the parts per million, if I'm not mistaken. 400 is somewhere where it's now, and we're trying to bring that down, to bring down the level of CO2 density in the atmosphere. And then the other one is 1.5 degrees of Celsius of overall temperature increase from the pre-industrial era, because the higher it gets, we go to a point of no return. Am I right?
Yeah, exactly.
Professor, my other question, as I mentioned earlier, was, is this a time period where there is a lack of hydropower supply within our system?
Yeah, usually this is the dry season and no rains, and as a result, of course, reservoirs will be drawn down faster, and as a result, obviously the hydropower generation goes down. So the hydropower capacity will naturally go down during this period. That's an issue. But I don't know at the moment that is the issue, because obviously usually if you have other power plants, those power plants can come in when there is no enough hydro. But I think probably this its primary energy source is lack of primary energy source, that oil may be an issue. I'm not sure, but overall this period is quite difficult.
Professor, when it comes to solar, once again, there are multiple different arguments on this, but a natural argument comes into play where they ask a country blessed with easily more than 300 days of sunshine on average, why are we still not utilizing the maximum benefits of solar? I've heard scientifically, you can correct me if I'm wrong, that there's a problem where you can't really store solar for too long. But now I believe there are some companies like Tesla, for example, that are developing new batteries that can truly store solar for a longer period. And I think recent experiments have shown that they are trying out aircrafts that can fly entirely on solar power. So amidst all these developments, Professor, coming back to that point once again, on average, more than 300 days of absolute sunshine, blessed with it to a certain extent, why are we still not seeing Sri Lanka being in the forefront of solar?
Of course, again, coming back to my original statement that different countries have to address these issues in different ways. As I said, Sri Lanka, obviously we have a lot of sunshine, and then at the same time, as you quite rightly said, we have to be able to store this energy in some form.
Because you can't straight away supply all the solar power, because then it kind of puts the grid off balance. Am I correct?
Yeah, that's one thing. Number two, of course, when the solar is there, it's during the daytime. So you may need power in the night. So what do you do during the night? So you have to store the energy which generated during the daytime in some form so that it can be utilized in the night. So one way to do that is, of course, store energy in the large hydro reservoirs. So you can not utilize reservoirs during, or rather hydropower during the daytime. So that is in effect net energy saving or storage, and use solar power as much as possible during the daytime. But that may not be enough, because we don't have enough hydropower to do that all the time, right? And then you have to look at battery storage, for instance. Battery storage is one way of doing storing energy, but then the cost of it will have to come in. And put together, it may not be as easy when it comes to economics. Sometimes battery storage plus solar power put together, it may not be as cheap as one would like to say. That's one issue. Then intermittency. Solar power, we have a lot of sunshine, no doubt about it. But when a cloud comes, suddenly it drops. It can be very, very small percentage of the total when a cloud comes. Then when the cloud goes away, again it jumps up.
No one wants to wait looking at the sky for a cloud to go away for the TV to get switched on.
Exactly. And also that change can need to be absorbed by the system. That's not easy sometimes. Okay. So you need, of course we have technologies. The cost of those technologies also matter. Then, as I said, the land scarcity. I mean, we think that we have a lot of land, but land has a lot of alternative uses also. Correct. So it's not easy to find land.
We have to optimize the opportunity cost, as you
exactly. Said. And then biodiversity and other issues. For instance, I mean, if I take an example, now we put up a wind power plant. Asian Development Bank funded 100 megawatt wind power plant in Mena. That's the largest wind power plant. Yes. And but of course we had to address the biodiversity, the bird migratory bird issue there. Correct.
And we brought may I ask how that was done?
Yeah, we brought in a very nice technology, radar-based technology, to detect these bird movements and then switch off the turbines during that period. Excellent. And in fact, it's a first in ADB, and we are very proud of that technology being adapted here.
Fantastic. What about the national energy policy? What is included in this? Let's talk about that on the other side of this short break. This is Bisnomics. Welcome back to Bisnomics. We are in conversation with Professor Priyantha Wijayatunga on the current energy crisis of Sri Lanka and the way forward. Professor, now, does our country have a proper national energy policy? We have been a pioneer in terms of power supply. We've been receiving power on a public level since 1895, a few years after London got it. So we've been one of those pioneers in terms of energy supply to the masses and the public. But as a country, at a time that new developments have taken place, new ways of looking at energy has come into the picture, and all the talks about sustainability, sustainable ways of powering up an economy, urbanization happening from one side, when all these things happen, I think that calls for a proper national energy policy. Does Sri Lanka have a proper national energy policy?
We do. Interestingly, the first energy policy which I can recall used to be somewhere in mid-80s during Professor Mohan Munasinghe's time as the energy advisor to the president at the time. But then, of course, there was a long lapse of about 10 years or so, or even more, before we got the second national energy policy. In between, we were trying to update it, but finally, eventually, in 2008, 2009, we managed to get a comprehensive energy policy adapted in Sri Lanka. Then afterwards, of course, there was a comprehensive update again recently in 2019. And we have been having a pretty good energy policy from that viewpoint. And each of these energy policies had very important focus in different policy elements. If I tell you a couple of them, I mean, ensuring energy security, ensuring proper energy access, and strengthening renewable clean energy development, and affordable energy to the population, and reliability improvement, and even things like providing opportunities to innovation and entrepreneurship. They are all part of policy elements, and there are certain actions proposed within the policy to implement these policy elements. So we have had pretty good energy policies right throughout since 1980s.
Main problems of the hydro sector. Now, as you very correctly said, in the dry season, we do face issues with power generation. But at the same time, Professor, during the months of heavy rain, we hear talks of floods. I mean, and when this cycle repeats on an annual basis, I am no engineer, I am no electricity specialist or a power specialist, but from a very basic physics perspective or a very common sense perspective, I would like to ask, does it not mean that we need to build more capacity and further enhance the capacity of our reservoirs so that we can store this water and use it for generating more power? Am I being, in terms of what I say, is it fool's gold or is it something practical?
Yeah, I mean, you are right. Hydropower is one of the most important primary energy sources we are blessed with in this country, and we have developed our large hydropower to almost to the maximum. We may have floods at certain times, but then how much of it can be captured in terms of hydropower is another. That's not easy.
Correct. You need that elevation and certain developments.
Exactly. And so overall, if you look at the system, we have already developed all large hydropower, and I think we are in the process of developing the last few ones like Umaoya, Broadlands, and in fact, Sri Lanka, Asian Development Bank is funding Morogala power plant, which is a 30 megawatt power plant. So they are more or less the final stages of large hydropower development here. But we have small hydropower, which is being developed quite a lot, and it goes on, and it continues the development of it. So I think we should support small hydropower development to the extent possible, and that can continue for some time until such time we fully exploit these resources.
Let's talk nuclear. Not the most common topic that everyone speaks of. In fact, a few years back when there was a proposed nuclear power plant coming up in India, I remember Sri Lanka was worried, what about a nuclear impact? But when you get to the science of it, Professor, it's one of the cleanest forms of energy in the world. But what's the fear? Is it the ghosts of experiences like Chernobyl, or are there any other factors at play? How come even the world so far is slow to adopt nuclear power for their countries?
Yeah, decision to go for nuclear or expanding nuclear power is not that easy, that decision. The reason being, actually, nuclear looks quite clean when it comes to obviously climate issues, because you don't have greenhouse gas emissions as such, you don't have emissions of local pollutants, air pollutions,
Correct.
And then even particulate matter for that matter.
But
then
is radiation an issue?
Exactly. What do you do with the nuclear waste? Because once nuclear fuel is used in a power plant, you have spent fuel, and that needs to be stored. You cannot do anything else, but you just keep on storing nuclear waste. And what do you do with it? And that can be an environmental disaster easily. And What about when it comes to accidents? I'm not saying that the accidents happen often, but look, your example, what you took, Chernobyl. I have been to Chernobyl actually. I have been in that site. It's like a ghost town now. A beautiful city.
Correct.
Evacuated overnight. Now all abandoned.
But now nature is slowly growing back, isn't it? It's becoming kind of a wildlife hotspot. In one of the Sir David Attenborough documentaries, he was showing how the place is now flushed with wildlife.
Yeah, you can see it's how many years after. That's the important thing. So there are a lot of uncertainties like that when it comes to nuclear. At the same time, you have to accept the fact that the technology has developed significantly, and the safety features have developed significantly. So there may be all the safety features which can be with which we can be quite comfortable to accept nuclear. But then all these factors will have to be taken into consideration once when a country decides to go for nuclear. So that's not an easy decision, particularly for a small country like us.
And especially a country like Sri Lanka, which is densely populated, the impact even of a slightest of nuclear disaster can be massive.
Exactly.
A couple of towns can get wiped out overnight.
Exactly.
Professor, when we look at the Sri Lankan energy context, the power supply context, long term, medium term and short term. Let's start with the short term. Over the next 1 year, over the next 5 years and beyond, what is your outlook in terms of the energy supply in Sri Lanka, especially for the power sector?
Yeah, as I explained to you before, it's very important that we look at diversification of our power supplies, primary energy sources. And we have been at one point relying completely on hydropower. And then, of course, we moved gradually to certain thermal based power plants. It's time that we move into more and more clean energy sources. One thing for the reliability and the continuity of power supplies, and the other is, of course, pressure on climate change issues. And the world is changing, and the availability of financing for different sources of energy changing. For instance, the recent energy policy of ADB said we will never fund a coal power plant. So that means the financing sources are drying up. It's not just Asian Development Bank, but many other funding sources will be drying up.
Professor, on another note, though, we see countries like France that came out with bold statements to reduce the coal power plant usage. Now they are going back on their word and trying to go back to coal because of certain issues.
Yeah, that may be true, but I don't think it's in the long term that will be reversed at all. Because the trend, the requirements are such that eventually, if you think of this 1.5 degree temperature target,
yes, keeping it below that.
Exactly, and we have our contribution to make. So diversification is very important. I think from that viewpoint, the government's intention to go for the 70% renewable energy target is a very good thing.
But is that target practical?
It can be practical. As I told you, now we have already got 30% hydropower. So we start from 30%, and then we have another, maybe about 5 to 7% or even 10% of small renewable energy systems. So we are already up in the deal at the moment itself. And then overall, getting 70% is not that difficult, frankly, and it is a good intention, and we should all support. And that's how the world is moving towards. And I think that diversification is very important. From that viewpoint, as I told you, Asian Development Bank has been supporting quite a lot right throughout for diversification and this renewable energy development. And Mana Wind Park is the best example. And we incorporated all necessary technologies to make sure that it is the right one. And then we are supporting Sebalandu, renewable energy park. We are supporting Punarin renewable energy park, and we support Morogolla, and we continue to support all this. And of course, to tell you, we are supporting a small pilot microgrid in University of Moratuwa through LECO. Fantastic. And that's also another way of addressing some of the reliability issues.
Microgrids,
okay. And solar plus battery and so on, and it's a microgrid which can be replicated. LECO is really looking at replicating this model in other places, and this is for the use of all the universities in this country to learn and develop their capacity eventually to make use of this system. So overall, I think Sri Lanka should make use of these financing opportunities to maximize the benefit to the country, and that's Understood. What we appeal.
Yeah. Professor, also as I been asked, for how long do you expect the existing crisis of regular power cuts and all that to continue? Where do we see an end to the problem?
In fact, in the short term, you have many solutions. Of course, but they may not be as cheap. For instance, I mean, let's take your own house. If you can bring in a generator and you can fuel it with diesel or gasoline, you can run a generator and you can get your power supply. So that's a very short-term solution, but it's very expensive, and a country can do that. But keep in mind that will not be the long-term solution. So while you do this in the short term, it's going to be expensive, but you should think of the long term. Important thing is that you and I should pay the cost of electricity, and the tariff at the moment does not reflect the cost of electricity.
It's heavily subsidized.
Extremely heavily subsidized, and you and I should not be subsidized when we can pay for it, right? Of course, there are population groups which really need lifeline tariffs. We should protect them. We should subsidize them so that it's affordable to them, to be inclusive.
And let me ask, Sri Lanka does have one of the lowest tariffs for electricity, isn't it?
Not necessarily the lowest, but since our generation cost is quite high,
the
electricity tariff is not recovering the overall cost.
Understood.
Right? Important thing is that cost recovery should come into play and protect, the population groups which needs protection will have to be subsidized, but others will have to pay the cost of electricity. We don't do that, and so financial sustainability of the sector is very important to sustain a reliable energy supply in this country. So that's the key message what I would like to give to all of you.
Professor Priyantha Wijayatunga, thank you so much for joining us, sharing your valuable expertise on the current power crisis, the way forward and what we need to do. As you very correctly said, there's a lot of right things to be done, and we need to do with them sooner than later in terms of diversifying our power supplies and making sure that our current facilities are running at the best they could. And as you very correctly mentioned, having the right price for electricity, and at the same time making sure that we take the proper long-term action is essential while sticking to some of the current short-term solutions. Thank you so much for joining us, and wishing you and the team at the ADB all the best to keep on powering up the power sector and the energy sector of Sri Lanka. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Charu. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you.
No matter what business you may be in, power is an essential input. And as a business owner or a business decision maker, naturally you may have been worried. And we hope that some of the ideas and thoughts that were brought forward today gives you an insight on the way forward for the power sector and the energy sector. And we hope that the authorities of this country were listening to the valuable thoughts shared by our guest today. I'm Tharandu Amarasekara, and no matter what business you may be in, no matter what challenges you may be having, I wish you a powerful week ahead. This is Bisnomics.